For question 4, we are told in Australia there are a large number of credit card products available to consumers from banks, credit unions and other financial institutions. We have a file with a whole lot of credit card products from back in June 2007. This in fact was a previous research report. And we're asked to use that credit card data to go through and look at specifically the interest rates, and we've got a few tasks to complete. First one, we've got to do a histogram, then we've got to do the mean, median and mode using the functions of Excel. We've then got to have a look at the Q1 and Q3, so our quartiles, construct a box and whisker plot, and then comment on the distribution. So we're going to start off with part A, the histogram, and of course to create the histogram we'll need to initially create a frequency distribution, and that can be done using a pivot table. So mouse in the top left hand cell, A1, and then we can go to Insert, Pivot Table. Just check that it's found the correct range of data. It has. We've got 312 credit card products, so we need to go down to row 313, and in fact I'm going to put this onto a new worksheet page. So I'll say OK. I've got my skeleton table. I've got the fields representing each of the columns over on the right. Interest rate is what I'm wanting to analyse, so I'm going to drag interest rate to the row fields. And you can see it goes through and finds all of those different interest rates. Of course, we don't want to look at them individually, we want to group them into classes. So we can go into the group option by just right-clicking on any one of those. The box that appears will ask you to have the starting, ending and then a by value. Now the default settings are for Excel just to find the minimum and the maximum, and Excel will have a guess at what class width you want to use, and here it has chosen 1. It doesn't hurt to, if you haven't already got an idea of what classes you want, just to say OK and to have a look. Now certainly in using a class width of 1, we've got too many classes for this amount of data. Probably thinking somewhere, 6, 7, 8. It can sometimes end up being a bit higher if you've got, when you start to do your rounding, or if you've got a particularly large range, maybe with some gaps. But here, yeah, we could certainly try a width of 2. So we're going to do that. And the other thing to note is that the minimum of 7.72, if we use that as our starting point, the classes just look a little bit messy. It would be much nicer to have them with whole numbers. So we'll go back into group and we'll make our width 2. Now you could round down to 7, and certainly that would create classes of width 2, and you would have them nice and neat, a good number of classes. The only other thing to keep in mind here is that just in terms of doing some analysis, it may be nice to distinguish between cards that have a single digit interest rate and a double digit interest rate. And so if we go back in one last time, just because of the nature of interest rates, we might want to round down further to 6, so that then we get 6 to 8, 8 to 10, 10 to 12 and so on, so that we can clearly see the distinction between those single digit and double digit interest rates, and that can make the discussion that little bit easier. So having made our classes, we can then drag interest rate into the data items area. Just double check that it's counted, and it has. And I can now go into my pivot table options menu, select a pivot chart. I just use my basic 2D column, say OK, and then I just need to do a little bit of formatting on that. So remove the legend. For histograms we do not need legends. We need to right click on any one of those columns, go into format the data series and make the gap width 0. It's nice to go into your formatting, add some outline that can just help highlight those columns. We can go in, we can adjust our title, maybe something like distribution of credit card interest rates June 2007. Now that's quite large, so I probably want to go back and just adjust the font size. I can go into my layout, I can add in some labels, so put interest rates, and I can put in the vertical, which in this case is just frequency. Okay, so that's a pretty nice histogram, and certainly we can start to see that there are some interesting patterns developing there. Now, before we go into the actual discussion, we will have a look at the remaining tasks. The last part is to discuss the results. So let's go through and see what else we need to work out. And in fact, for part B, we've been asked to do the mean, median, and mode, and then C, the quartiles. So we'll just stay on this page, and certainly we can use the built-in functions, which is the idea of these particular exercises. So anytime you're going to get Excel to do a formula for you, you need to firstly start with equals. That tells Excel that it's a formula and not just text or a number. And then we have to use the formula for the particular calculation we want to perform. Now for means, Excel actually has a formula called average, so they use the average keyword, and we can type in average. In fact, you can see Excel, as we start to type, it prompts us with possible functions that we might be interested in. We want average, we open our brackets, we need to say where the data is. We're wanting to analyse column C, so that's C2 to C313. So I could have blocked on, but to save scrolling down the screen, we'll just type in the range, and you can see as I do that, Excel actually highlights that column for me. Close my brackets, say OK, or enter, and it gives me the average, or mean as we call it. So in fact, let's just type in some labels. So that's our mean, 15.07785256%. Now we can adjust the formatting. We can reduce the number of decimal places to say 2 decimal places. Excel rounds that off, and so we can say the average credit card rate is 15.08%. Next we want to do the median, and again Excel has a built-in function, so we start with equals. The function is just median, and again we need to say where the data is. So median a little bit higher than the mean, and again we can round that off to 2 decimal places. We want to do the mode. We've got a formula for that, equals mode, say where the data is, and the mode is 17.99. Now remember, for numerical data, mode isn't always as useful. When we're working with numbers, there can be many different individual numbers that can occur, especially here where we're looking at interest rates that go to 2 decimal places. So the mode can be a little bit deceptive in that respect, is that it's not necessarily going to give you an indication of central tendency. So you've got to be a bit careful. It can be, in the case of numerical data, better to talk about the modal class, which we could have seen from the histogram is in fact 16 to 18. So you've just got to be a little bit careful when you think about modes for numerical data. That takes care of part B. We also wanted to do part C, which is our Q1 and our Q3. So quartiles, well, equals again to say it's a function, and then our keyword is quartile. Open the brackets. Now this time we've got to put 2 bits of information in. Firstly, we've got to say the range, which is C2 to C313, comma, and then we've got to say the quartile we want. Now here we want the first quartile, so it's just 1, close the brackets, hit enter, and that is 11.49. So 25% of the data is below that value. And for Q3, well again we use the quartile function, same data range, but this time our quart value is 3. We want the third quartile, and that's 17.99. So 50% of the data lies between those 2 values. So that takes care of part C. Part D, we're asked to construct a box plot, or a box and whisker plot as we also call them, of the interest rates. Now, to do a box and whisker plot, we need our Q1, our Q2 and Q3. Q2 is just the median, so in fact let's just remind ourselves, we'll just add that into the label. So we've already calculated our median. We've got quartile 1, we've got quartile 3. We also need the minimum and the maximum. Now you can get those from just scanning down through the sorted column, but there is also a min and a max function in case you want to save yourself the effort of scrolling. And we can type that in, and we can see that in fact the maximum is 19.4. So we'll just highlight those. Those 5 bits of information are used to create the box and whisker plot. In fact, a box and whisker plot is also known as a 5-point summary of the data. Now, most versions of Excel don't have a built-in box plot chart, and so we've generally recommended just constructing one. Getting those values, you still want it to be to scale. You can draw it by hand and sort of scan it, or you can just use the drawing tools within Excel or Word to create that box and whisker plot. And I've already prepared one earlier because I'm sure you didn't need to sort of see me sit and create boxes and lines. The main thing is that it should be approximately to scale. That middle 50% between Q1 and Q3 is represented by the box. We put a line on to represent the median, and then we create the whiskers from Q1 down to the minimum, as well as from Q3 up to the maximum. And in some ways it gives us a similar impression to the histogram. I think for this data here, the histogram is probably of more use to us than the box and whisker plot, because in the histogram we can see that sort of two trend situation that we have, where there's sort of high rate cards and low rate cards, whereas the box and whisker plot doesn't necessarily, well, it doesn't give us that sort of detail. So it can be not always appropriate to use a box and whisker plot. Where box and whisker plots are really great is when you have, say, 3, 4, 5 sets of data, and you want to, instead of sort of creating a whole lot of individual histograms and then trying to visualize them, if you create box and whisker plots and put them all on the one scale, you can get a very nice sense of how the data sets compare in terms of the position and that sort of 50% box. So that's where they're more useful. For here, the histogram certainly would be the preferred chart to show the distribution. Okay, so overall, what can we say to finish this off and complete part E? Well, we could say the distribution of credit card interest rates is somewhat bimodal. The most frequent interest rate class is that between 16 and 18%, indicating that there are a significant number of high rate interest cards. The second most frequent class is that between 8 and 10%, thus indicating that there are also a large number of low rate cards, and hence providing for the bimodal shape. So that sort of dual trend within the market we can refer to as bimodal. Even though those two classes weren't exactly the same height, they were two distinct peaks within the distribution, and they did therefore indicate that sort of split in the market. So they're the types of things that we'd be interested to comment on with this set of data.